At the end of World War II in 1945, Korea found itself divided along the 38th parallel. The Soviet Union occupied the north, while the United States controlled the south. Amid this division, a former guerrilla fighter named Kim Il-sung emerged as a key figure in North Korea's future. Born in 1912, Kim had fought against Japanese colonial rule, gaining recognition from the Soviet Union. With Stalin's support, he was chosen as the leader of the Korean Workers' Party, KWP, in 1946, positioning himself as the head of North Korea's new government. In 1948, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, was officially established, with Kim Il-sung as its first premier. Kim quickly consolidated power, eliminating political rivals and enforcing strict ideological control. He promoted Juche, a philosophy of self-reliance, which became the foundation of North Korea's identity. By the early 1950s, his leadership faced its first major challenge, the Korean War. 1953. Kim believed in a swift military unification of Korea. With support from the USSR and China, he launched a surprise attack on South Korea in June 1950. The war, however, did not go as planned. The US and United Nations forces intervened, pushing North Korean troops back. China later entered the war, stabilizing the front near the original border. By 1953, an armistice was signed, leaving Korea divided and war-torn. Despite failing to unify the peninsula, Kim used the war to strengthen his control. He portrayed himself as a victorious leader who defended Korea from imperialist aggression. His cult of personality intensified, with propaganda depicting him as the nation's great leader. As North Korea entered the 1960s, Kim Il-sung's power was absolute, and the nation was increasingly isolated from the world. His vision of an independent, militarized, and ideologically pure North Korea set the stage for the decades to come. By the early 1960s, Kim Il-sung had cemented his grip over North Korea. His Juche ideology, which emphasized self-reliance in politics, economy, and military, became the official state doctrine. The country cut off most foreign influences, focusing instead on heavy industrialization, a strong military, and an extreme personality cult centered around Kim. Isolation and the cult of personality. Kim systematically removed any opposition within the Korean Workers' Party, KWP. In 1967, he launched a purge targeting pro-Soviet and pro-Chinese factions, ensuring that only his loyalists remained in power. Statues, songs, and literature glorifying him filled the country. His face appeared on every building, and his words became absolute law. Schools taught that Kim was a near-divine figure, the son of the nation, who had single-handedly liberated Korea from imperialists. North Korea's economic model in the 1960s initially showed success. Massive state-run industrial projects boosted production, and the country's economy outperformed South Korea's during the early part of the decade. However, by the 1970s, cracks began to appear. The state-controlled economy lacked innovation, and trade restrictions due to its isolation led to stagnation. A militarized state and foreign relations. Kim Il-sung placed military strength at the core of his rule. Under his military-first, Songun, policy, North Korea poured resources into building one of the world's most formidable standing armies. He maintained a hostile stance toward South Korea and the United States, carrying out multiple border skirmishes and espionage missions. 1968. North Korean commandos infiltrated Seoul in an attempt to assassinate South Korean President Park Chung-hee. The mission failed, but it heightened tensions. 1968. North Korea captured the USS Pueblo, a U.S. Navy intelligence ship, accusing it of espionage. The crew was held for nearly a year before being released. 1969. 1976. The Korean DMZ axe murder incident when North Korean soldiers killed 2 U.S. officers in the demilitarized zone brought the peninsula close to another war. Despite these hostilities, Kim sought to expand his influence internationally. During the Cold War, he aligned with the Soviet Union and China, receiving military and economic aid. However, by the late 1970s, China had begun opening up to the world, and the Soviet Union was facing economic difficulties. North Korea, still isolated, struggled to maintain its economy. Economic decline and dynastic succession. By the 1980s, North Korea's economy had fallen behind South Korea's booming development. Kim Il-sung refused to implement economic reforms, fearing they would weaken his control. Food shortages and energy crises worsened, but state propaganda continued to paint North Korea as a utopia. Meanwhile, Kim began preparing for his greatest legacy, turning North Korea into a hereditary dictatorship. In 1980, he officially named his son, Kim Jong-il, as his successor. This was unprecedented in a communist state, where leadership was traditionally based on party loyalty rather than family ties. By the end of the 1980s, North Korea was economically weak, politically isolated, and heavily militarized. Kim Il-sung remained unchallenged, but the world around him was changing. The collapse of the Soviet Union loomed on the horizon, and with it, North Korea's most crucial support system. As North Korea entered the late 1980s, Kim Il-sung remained firmly in power, but his regime faced growing internal and external challenges. The world around him was changing. The Cold War was coming to an end, the Soviet Union was collapsing, and China was embracing economic reforms. These events left North Korea increasingly isolated and economically unstable. The fall of communism and North Korea's isolation. For decades, Kim Il-sung had relied on economic and military aid from the Soviet Union and China. However, in 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall signaled the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe. By 1991, the Soviet Union had dissolved, leaving North Korea without its strongest ally and financial backer. Trade with former Soviet states plummeted, leading to severe shortages of fuel, raw materials, and food. China, under Deng Xiaoping, shifted toward a market economy and normalized relations with South Korea in 1992, further cutting off North Korea. Without external support, North Korea's economy shrank dramatically, and its industries struggled to function. Despite this, Kim Il-sung refused to implement reforms, fearing they would weaken his authoritarian control. Instead, he tightened internal repression, ordering mass purges and enforcing absolute loyalty to the regime. The 1990s, economic collapse and famine. By the early 1990s, North Korea was on the verge of a major crisis. Industries failed, food production collapsed, and power shortages crippled cities. As reports of malnutrition and starvation spread, the regime continued to hide the true extent of the crisis from its people. In response, Kim Il-sung sought to maintain control through military expansion and diplomatic maneuvering. He launched nuclear weapons development, leading to increasing tensions with the United States. In 1993, North Korea announced its withdrawal from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, sparking fears of a nuclear crisis. The international community, including the US and China, pressured North Korea to halt its nuclear ambitions, leading to diplomatic talks. Despite these tensions, Kim Il-sung initiated discussions with South Korea for reconciliation. In 1994, he planned to meet South Korean President Kim Young-sam in a historic summit, something that had never happened before. The death of the great leader. On July 8, 1994, just before the planned summit, Kim Il-sung suffered a massive heart attack and died at the age of 82. His death sent shockwaves through North Korea. The regime declared a prolonged period of mourning, and millions of North Koreans were forced to publicly grieve, with propaganda portraying him as an eternal leader. His son, Kim Jong-il, immediately took power, fulfilling the dynastic transition Kim Il-sung had carefully prepared for decades. This marked the first hereditary succession in a communist state, setting a precedent for North Korea's future leadership. The legacy of Kim Il-sung. Kim Il-sung left behind a country that was isolated from the world, with few allies, economically devastated, on the brink of famine, militarized, with an ongoing nuclear weapons program, ruled by a cult of personality, where his image and ideology dominated all aspects of life. Even after his death, he was declared North Korea's eternal president, and his influence remained deeply rooted in the country's political system. His rule shaped North Korea into the authoritarian, totalitarian state it remains today. With the death of Kim Il-sung in 1994, North Korea entered one of its most turbulent and devastating periods. His son, Kim Jong-il, took power, but the country was already on the verge of economic collapse and humanitarian disaster. The final years of the 20th century were marked by famine, international isolation, and the continuation of authoritarian rule. The struggle for power. Kim Jong-il's consolidation, 1994–1997. Although Kim Jong-il had been designated as his father's successor since the 1980s, his leadership was not immediately secured. The transition from Kim Il-sung to Kim Jong-il was the first hereditary succession in a communist country, and many within the ruling elite were uncertain about his ability to govern. To solidify his power, Kim Jong-il strengthened the military-first policy, Sunggun, giving absolute priority to the army, purged any remaining officials who opposed his rule, continued his father's cult of personality, ensuring that loyalty to the Kim family remained unquestioned. By 1997, Kim Jong-il had firmly established control, but North Korea was facing its greatest crisis yet, that threatened the very survival of the regime. The Great Famine. The Arduous March. 1994–1999. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 had already left North Korea economically crippled. Without Soviet subsidies and trade, industries shut down, and the state's ability to distribute food collapsed. However, the situation turned catastrophic when a series of natural disasters hit North Korea in the mid-1990s. 1995. Heavy floods destroyed farmland and grain reserves. 1996. Further floods and mismanagement worsened food shortages. 1997. A severe drought devastated crops, pushing the country into full-scale famine. The regime called this period the Arduous March, but in reality, it was one of the worst famines in modern history. Estimates suggest that between 240,000 to 3.5 million North Koreans died due to starvation and disease. Despite the disaster, Kim Jong-il refused to enact economic reforms that could weaken state control. Instead, he restricted information, preventing North Koreans from knowing the true scale of the famine, blocked international humanitarian aid, fearing that foreign influence would undermine his regime, strengthened border security, preventing starving citizens from escaping to China or South Korea. North Koreans were forced to survive on grass, tree bark, and anything edible. Reports of cannibalism and desperate acts to obtain food became common. Yet, during this period, the elite and military remained well-fed, as Kim prioritized the survival of the ruling class over the general population. Nuclear tensions and international relations. 1994–1999. While North Korea faced internal devastation, it continued its aggressive stance against the world. The nuclear crisis, which had started in the early 1990s, remained a key concern for global powers. In 1994, just before his death, Kim Il-sung had agreed to freeze North Korea's nuclear program in exchange for aid from the U.S. Agreed framework. However, under Kim Jong-il, North Korea secretly continued developing nuclear weapons, despite accepting aid from international donors. In 1998, North Korea shocked the world by launching the Taepodong-1 missile over Japan, signaling its military ambitions. The launch triggered international sanctions, further worsening North Korea's economic situation. However, Kim Jong-il used these crises to demand more aid, threatening to escalate tensions whenever food and resources ran low. End of the 20th century. North Korea's uncertain future. By 1999, North Korea was at a crossroads. The famine had left the country economically broken, but the regime survived. Kim Jong-il had fully consolidated power, proving his ability to rule despite internal opposition. The military remained loyal, ensuring that the government could control its people through force and propaganda. Nuclear weapons became the regime's key bargaining tool, allowing North Korea to demand international aid while maintaining its isolation. As the 20th century ended, North Korea remained one of the most mysterious, isolated, and repressive states in the world. The country had survived the death of its founding leader, endured mass starvation, and continued its military provocations, setting the stage for the challenges of the 21st century.